Okay, everybody, I have time to get started here with our third installment of a webinar to try to address some of the issues with the current drought we're having. Again, these webinars are all posted on our Drought Response website. The recordings of these are. So hopefully if you're watching this recording, then you'll be able to get back in contact with us if you have any questions. But as we go along, if you have any questions that you'd like to ask, if you'll just type those in the chat box, and maybe I'll ask Jenny to kind of watch that and monitor that as we go along. So I'm going to begin with talking about some principles that relate to culling in beef cow herds as it relates to reducing numbers to cope with drought or mitigate the negative effects of drought, both economically and production wise. I'm also, with that discussion, being geared toward beef cattle, I'll also tie in some on small ruminants and where we can on dairy cattle as well, and answer some of those questions, maybe if there's some specifics about other species that we deal with. And then after I wrap up the discussion on talking about culling in beef cow herds and cow-calf production, then Jenny Ivy will jump in and add anything that might be different or unique nuances to equine horse ownership. So we'll move that way. And again, encourage you, excuse me, as we have questions, to just type those in the chat box as we go along. So first things first, I really think that we need to start with taking a step back from the situation and realizing that it seems very urgent, and it is indeed very urgent, but there are some things that we can make better decisions on, I think, if we try to remove ourselves from the urgency and sometimes the emotion of the situation and just be really pragmatic about what we're trying to do and what our objectives are. So first thing is, we need to think about, are we trying to maintain a purebred herd, a seed stock herd, or a commercial herd? And sometimes many of us will, excuse me, will dance between those two and try to do a little bit of both. But I think this might be an opportunity to look at that and kind of create a division of labor there and focus in on what our objectives are. Certainly some of you out there would have enough numbers to do both and do both very effectively. But if we're a small herd and trying to do a little bit of both, this may be a good time to step back and just make the decision of what our objective is going to be in cattle production. If we're a commercial producer, are we selling our calves at weaning, or are we selling those at yearling? I'll kind of finish up too with talking about some opportunity to change our cow stocking rate and flex a little bit between years when we have enough drought and just keeping the calves, and instead of pushing the stocking rate so much with cows, go to selling yearlings some in some years when that's a good opportunity to do that. And then finally, are we making these decisions based on economics or emotion? Again, I realize that most of us would be in beef cattle production to make some money and to have that investment in our land, create some revenue as we hold that. But I also realize that a few that might be watching this would have a different set of objectives, and a decision-making process will be separate. But I'll just tell you that as I go through the rest of this discussion, then I'll focus really specifically on this from an economic standpoint, making these decisions based on trying to make a little money, or maybe in this year lose as little as we can get away with. We also want to be confident and proactive. So I've been working with beef cattle producers long enough to have seen this be, I guess, my fourth drought cycle that I've worked through, where it got serious enough that we needed to respond to it specifically. And what I have seen in years past is that we'll want to try to just wait to make a decision, whether it's to buy hay and feed or to sell cows, whatever, or to do some culling. Then we'll just kind of wait and see, well, maybe next week or maybe next week. Excuse me. And we get into a situation where we've gone too far and the economics have passed us by to have been able to deal with it effectively. So I really think that if we can be confident in the information we have, proactive with our decisions, it'll help us in the long run. It's kind of like making a marketing decision. We want to try to hit it the very best and, as they say, catch a falling knife, but sometimes we get cut when we try to do that. So just from a risk management standpoint, being confident and proactive is what I've seen be the most effective way to approach drought and coping with drought. And then also, as we go through this discussion, excuse me, think about embracing the opportunities. Again, this is a situation where when you see as severe as the drought's getting now and severe as we've dealt with in years past, that it doesn't feel very opportune of a thing to have to deal with. But if we can separate ourselves from the emotion and sheer emotion of it, there are some opportunities to be found, especially in this culling process as we go through. All right, I want to give an example of phase culling. This the first time I saw it referred to as phase culling was actually in a publication from the Robert Noble Foundation there in Oklahoma, and put it forth in I thought, a logical stepwise fashion. And I want to start with that, and then we'll talk more about the specifics of how to make these decisions that are encapsulated in this idea of phase culling. So phase one is going to be something that Dr. Smith had covered in our first webinar, and that Dr. Ivy also talked about as well from the equine standpoint, and Dr. Loveday from small ruminants. But managing the nutrition, the delivery of nutrition, that's the primary concern in a drought situation. And we really just, when we're talking about culling, all we're talking about doing is taking the pressure off the hay and feed resources. So we need to decide how much pasture and hay we're going to have available, or feed to stretch that hay, whatever the case is. So I'd encourage you to go back and watch that first webinar for whatever species you're dealing with, and to be able to make these decisions better, like things like salvaging crop residue and running cattle on crop residue, whether it's some temporary electric fence to do that, and mobile water and that kind of thing, whatever you need to do to have that available. Consider leasing or custom grazing. There's some things to be concerned with that from a health standpoint, especially if we're moving cattle long distances and from state to state to do some custom grazing. You know, I guess it was back in 2007 and 2012 that we saw cattle moving from Texas to here, and vice versa, respectively. So when you make that big of a move, you can get in cattle exposed to some health situations they might not be used to. So that's something to think about there. But if you can find some other ground that you may not be using right now to have available, that's certainly going to be a good decision. And back on the fact of being proactive, remember that if we wait too long, hay and feed resources are going to continue to be more expensive as more pressure gets put on those in the marketplace. Phase two of this phase culling example is going to be to sell open cows. And again, I want to try to address this from other species. Dr. Loveday's on here now, and he might want to chime in too with some considerations specific to small ruminants. But basically, the first thing you want to do is try to identify some of these open animals, and the ones that aren't pregnant, that aren't going to be productive. Just a moment, let me try something here. All right, so phase two in this example, again, is going to be to go through and sell these open cows. And then part of that phase two also is would be taking some of the calf pressure off, and that might be weaning and selling the larger calves. Another thing I'll try to do as we go through here is address this from spring and fall calving. Right now, most of the fall calving herds are finishing up with their calving. Spring calves are already weaned and sold, so we're carrying some dry cows into the winter. So that takes a little bit of pressure off already there just by the natural production cycle. But something to think about there is in realizing a lot of us will still be calving year round. So if you have an opportunity to go in and just selectively pick the calves that are ready to be marketed, it's not a great market as we speak. If you're watching this recording later, even in later years, we're experiencing a down market as we're recording this. They may not be easy to do, but again, if you pencil out what it will cost to maintain those, trying to wait for a better market, then it may not actually work out to your benefit. And then consider weaning early. This is something Jason also mentioned in the first webinar of this series, early weaning, how that can positively affect the body condition of the cows. And in some situations like this, it does make sense to separate those calves off if you still want to put some weight on them to maintain them separately. so that you're feeding a cow with lower nutrient requirements, or maybe even think about weaning them early and marketing them as younger and lighter calves, whatever, however dire the situation gets to need to be able to do that. So that would be phase two, basically first and foremost, getting rid of any non-productive animals, whether that's calves that aren't gaining economic weight for you, or certainly the primary thing here to sell open cows and get go ahead and get those cows out of the herd. And I'll mention a concept here that we've talked about in some of these webinars already. If we're able to and kind of build on what I said about opportunities, if we're able to take this opportunity to get in a better management situation overall, if we're able to maintain a good tight calving season and get in the situation doing preg checking and knowing that annual evaluation on that cow, then likely if you're a spring calving herd, you would have already gotten rid of those non-producing cows, the ones that didn't get bred again, that aren't going to gestate a calf for you over the winter and give you something to sell next year. So if we're kind of doing our due diligence on best management practices, that part's already done. But if you haven't and you're watching this and need to respond in a different way, then I think first and foremost that after you determine what you have and how much feed you have, is to go ahead and get rid of those non-producers. So in this phase three, this phase culling example would be to sell the poor producers, sell some older cows. You may even want to think about selling some younger cattle too. That's a little bit, it gets into a dicier situation. It's going to be more specific and have some nuances for different types of producers. But certainly after you've gone through and sold the open cows, if you have good records, you can go through and look at the historical production data on any given cow and decide, well, she doesn't wean a calf, she calves a little bit, doesn't wean a heavy calf, she calves a little bit later in the calving season or in the year, whatever, however you're doing it, and go ahead and take this opportunity to weed those out. Again, if we're selling cows right now, it's not a great market, but we're not making this decision in a drought stress situation. We're not making this decision from the standpoint of market prices. We're making it from the standpoint of relieving pressure from the feed, and we have to bring those two together at some point. But right now we're talking about it from being able to stretch the feed reserves that we have and generate revenue to buy more feed, if that's part of it as well. Selling older cows, you may not have records on the age of your cows. Hopefully you'd have some tags in them and some idea of how old they are. But if you don't, then we'll talk about mouthing cows here, so we go through some more specifics of this. But identifying those older cows that may be getting toward the end of their productive lifespan, or some genetics that you might want to replace. And then certainly selling the non-conformers, the late calving cows, like I've already mentioned. But back on the opportunity theme here, tightening up the color, frame size, horned or polled, disposition, all those kinds of things. Basically, as you do this and as you're picking which cows you want to go ahead and liquidate and turn into revenue and take pressure off the feed, then those cows that produce calves that are off color, or whatever your objectives are for color pattern or uniformity in your calves, but that are going to make a product that don't fit the beef production chain very well. Just those cows that you happen to have around because you haven't replaced them yet. Again, this will be the opportunity to do that in phase three, even if they are did indeed get pregnant in the last breeding season. If you're going into the fall breeding, you're calving right now, along with making that decision of whether or not you might want to early wean or just early wean part of those cows and move pairs or something like that, then certainly this is going to be applicable to that as well, from selling the poor producers, older animals, the non-conformers. I think this would hold true in small ruminant production as well, to the extent that uniformity is important in that type of production. Phase four of this example is going to be selling replacement quality cows. So if it gets bad enough and we continue to be in dire straits on our feed supplies, then after we've weeded through and picked out the ones that really don't fit, then we may end up having to sell some cows that do fit, that we would like to keep. We just don't have the opportunity here. This is another place that I would look for other regions where grass is available. Not just, and I've got that point here on the slide as a way to advertise in those regions. Again, going back to the example of 2012, we ended up sending a lot of cattle from here to Texas. when we recovered from our drought in the meantime, a lot of cattle that were still under drought situations in Texas came here, and not just Texas, but the Southwest and the Deep South as well. So there tends to be a lot of cattle movement in these situations. But if you can find some grass, some custom grazing, example here would be in 2012, I knew a producer that sent his entire cow-calf herd to Oklahoma to be grazed for a 1-year contract until he could get things back in the right situation on his place, get some forward establishment in better shape, and be able to handle that, and then took those back. So that may be something, even though there's going to be a lot of cost associated with that in the movement. If it's a really dire situation, you want to maintain the core herd that you have rather than selling replacements. That could be an idea that you would want to do. And in that custom grazing, think of some unique situations like sharing the calf crop. In that example I just gave, those cattle moving from here to Oklahoma, that's kind of how they worked that out. They shared part of the calf crop for that person custom grazing that cow herd until he could get his place back in shape for it to come back. But even if you have to sell those cattle, get a little more unique about your advertising, work with the market operator that you use, maybe to find some places where they know that there is a stronger market for cows than we might have available here local to us. I want to stop here for a second, and Dr. Loveday, I muted your mic there as you got started, but if you wanted to throw in anything about this idea of culling in phases, stepwise, going through the ewe herd or the ewe flock, rather the goat herd, then if you want to unmute, if you have anything to say, you can just jump right in on that.
Well, I apologize for coming in late, but I had class, but I missed your first slide. But I think what you've picked up on this phasing is the importance of record keeping. You might have mentioned that at the front, but particularly depending on what kind of system you're in, we look at sheep and goats right now. In sheep, we're into that finishing breeding season, and it's awful hard to cull one right now that if you just ain't got bred, and hopefully start paying dividends here in the next few months. But if we don't have records, we're not going to be able to identify those that had difficulty lambing or kidding, and or did not lamb at all, or only raised one lamb out of a set of twins. So just point out the importance of record keeping.
Thank you. That's a really good point, and I didn't really talk about that much to start with, and but having the right records and from production, historical production of a cow, just or a ewe or a goat, to take the opportunity to go ahead and liquidate those that aren't doing well from year to year. Certainly takes records to know that. Very good point. So let's go ahead and talk about these steps that I've mentioned here a little bit more specifically. So just keep in mind as we go through these specific selection criteria that we would use in normal culling, but also more critically as it applies to drought management. Think about which phase we're going to use these in the stepwise manner that we want to get down to our very core best set of cows, best set of ewes, best set of goats that we're going to want to keep to expand on when we have the opportunity after we come out of this situation. So we'll talk about each of these points individually, and again relate that to fall and spring, and as well try to relate that to other species as we go along. So the first one, pregnancy checking that I mentioned. Again, I hope that that you'll consider doing this in normal years, even when we have plenty of grass. Just knowing, again, I mentioned this earlier, I think, but I always think of pregnancy check as your annual review. If you're a small business owner, if you work for someone off the farm, you'll know that if you don't continue to do your job very well, you're not going to get paid. If you have somebody working for you, then you're not going to continue to pay them if they're not doing their job very well or not doing their job at all. So that's the way I think of pregnancy checking. If a cow or a ewe or any commercial production, protein production species doesn't give you an offspring to sell, then they need to replace that lost revenue by you selling them. So if another kind of trite way that I say it is if they're not working for us, then we're working for them. We don't want that situation to come about. So identifying those cows or ewes or goats that aren't producing, that don't rebreed, and pregnancy checking is the most effective way to do that. Of course, right now, for when we're recording this, going into the fall, we're going to be rebreeding those fall calving cows that just bred somewhere in November, December, January, maybe. And we'll have to think about some techniques to get them recycling quicker in a drought situation and that kind of thing. But for the spring cows, if we haven't already done that, preg checking is going to be extremely important. Several different ways to do that. And I think that if you're in a situation where you don't have a defined calving season, and this wouldn't apply to the seasonal animals as much, but if you don't have a defined calving season, if the bull's in there year round, you're going to need to preg check in a way that tells you not just whether the cows are bred or open, but how far bred they are, so how far they are into that gestation. So usually that's going to take either hand palpation by a good experienced veterinarian or ultrasound by a veterinarian. So either of those two ways will tell you not just pregnant or open, but also how far along those cattle are. So with that, that's just another layer of information we'd have as we go through this culling process. If I cull the open ones, I still need to get rid of some cows to take some pressure off the feed resources. Then I can start culling animals that are not bred within the breeding season that I'm taking this opportunity to try to get to. So again, hand palpation, ultrasound are going to be the ways to do that and determine not just pregnant or open, but how far along they are. Another opportunity, though, that we have for preg checking is going to be the blood pregnancy test. UT College of Veterinary Medicine offers that if you're interested in trying to do a blood pregnancy test on your cows. Maybe if it's difficult to get somebody to come out and do a manual preg check, then you want to do the blood test, you can talk to your county agent, and they will have access to helping you get that information and materials to send that blood off to UT College of Vet Medicine or a commercial lab, either way, and get that. But what you get back on that, then not knowing when the cows should have been bred, is just a yes or no answer. They're either open or pregnant, and if they have to be at least 30 days pregnant for that blood pregnancy test to work. So if they're early pregnant, if they have to be at least 80 days past the last calf that they had. So you could get some false positives or some false negatives in a situation where you don't know what the breeding date should be or what the breeding season is. So if you have a defined breeding season, let's take a fall example, I'll go ahead and keep these animals and dedicate feed resources to them to keeping them through the winter, even though I've had to start using those earlier. But I want to preg check as early as I possibly can to get those cows off the dole and early wean the calves, if that's the way I'm doing, or selling pairs, whatever that takes. Then you could use the blood pregnancy test 30 days after the bull comes out and still be confident in it. But again, most of the situations that we're going to be dealing with would take an experienced technician, either with the ultrasound or hand palpation, to tell you where you are. For small ruminants, sheep and goats, certainly an opportunity to use ultrasound there and to be very accurate with where those females are in their gestation, and how to keep the ones that are going to lamb or kid early in that lambing or kidding season, and be able to keep the most productive ones in that situation as well. So preg checking is extremely important in any production situation, whether it's a good year or not, but its importance, I guess, maybe we'd just say, is amplified in a situation where we're trying to relieve some pressure from our feed resources. Say a few words too about body condition scoring, and this again we'll go back to specifically to the nutritional component. Let's say we've gone through phase one and we've culled out the cows that are open, or the cows that might be pregnant but not in the breeding and calving season that we're trying to shoot for. Then another criteria might be to look at the body condition score of those cows, because if we've got a bunch of thin pregnant cows that are going to take a tremendous amount of feed resources to feed back up into good condition before they calve, and again this will be same for the other species, we want to try to do that when they're dry. So if we're going in this if we got spring cows going dry into the winter, than in a normal year when we'd have plenty of feed resources and we'd say, okay, let's dedicate some more supplemental feed if we need that, depending on the forage analysis, hay analysis, and get them back in the right condition before they calve. But the difference here is that we're going to be limited on hay and feed resources. So even though it's a good time for a dry cow to be putting that weight on, it still might not be economically effective to keep those cows and dedicate more resources to them when we can keep some cows that are in a good body condition score, say a 5, 6, or 7, and even hedging more toward the more advanced body condition scores of 5 and 5.5, 6, or 7, and let them coast a little bit. So if we take, say a body condition score 4.5, 5 cow into the winter, and where we need to really be frugal, I should say, I guess I'll say, with our feed resources, and she loses some weight, and then all of a sudden we have a cow that's going to take a long time to rebreed after that. So we need to be next step really critical on this body condition score, and think about what we need to get them where they need to be. The other thing too is if you have a lot of cows that are in a body condition score like the one here in the lower right hand corner, 7, 8, 9, that kind of thing, or 8 and above, then that's an opportunity to probably think that you can change your stocking rate or limit the amount of feed resources you purchase. Either way you're doing that. If a cow's this heavy condition, there's something going on that's not really optimizing the production scenario. So a lot of things to think about there with the body condition score. And one thing that I usually say about body condition is you get toward the end of gestation and we have an opportunity, maybe we get some precipitation in this winter that's going to give us a pretty decent spring, maybe get some forage coming out when these cows start to calve. Maybe we be frugal with the feed resources early in the winter and then have them on an increasing plan of nutrition as they're going into the calving season, and then going into that peak lactation and trying to rebreed pretty quick after that. So Jason Smith's in here in the room. We're doing this from the same office. Jason, is there anything that you want to add about the maybe body condition score relative to what you'd already talked about earlier with nutrition?
No, Justin, I think you're spot on. And body condition scoring is really one of the major management practices that really allows us to view how we're doing from a nutritional management standpoint. And for a lot of times, if we have cattle that are over conditioned, especially during a time of drought, that's an opportunity where those cattle can go on a diet and it can save a lot of feed resources in doing so, but also from a more production standpoint, get them back into the level of condition they need to be profitable for us. And so I think for the most part, yeah, you've hit on everything from a nutrition standpoint on culling and a condition standpoint that I think we really need to be focused on.
Good. Good deal. Looking here just to make sure there aren't any questions in the chat box, and I don't see any yet, so we'll keep moving on here.
Let me add one thing there really quick, Justin. From a body condition scoring standpoint, if that's something that you don't have the experience in, you don't feel proficient in, that's an opportunity to, if you don't already have a relationship with your county extension agent, to use that as an opportunity to develop that relationship, because that's something they can definitely help to provide some training on and help you to do that. Because body condition scoring, it's probably the most subjective measurement we have. That doesn't mean that it's not a good measurement. So it takes some time in viewing some cattle of different conditions to really understand what that body condition score of 5 or 6 is that we really consider ideal based upon stage of production.
Yeah, absolutely. And we cover that quite a bit in most of the counties in our master beef producer, advanced master beef producer. So if you've been through that, you'll have the information from that, or if you haven't, and take that opportunity to go through and learn those techniques in there too, and really build that relationship like Jason was saying. Dr. Loveday, do you have anything to add on body condition for ewes and small ruminants?
What you said for cattle apply to sheep and goats, but another indicator, a thin ewe or a thin doe might be also an indicator she's a chronic in terms of a foot problem or an internal parasite problem. Just another reason that need to get rid of her.
Okay, good point there. All right, let me move on to the next subject here. Another thing that we want to look at is we're doing this critical culling in all these species is going to be the eye, and we're kind of getting past some of the big obvious things to look at. But again, if we're going to have to get into deeper into the herd and culling some cows that we think are really good productive cows, then these critical areas are going to be pretty important to get right. And cancer eye is one of those that if we can catch it early before a cow develops into a larger situation, or I guess more clinically severe situation of cancer eye, then we can go ahead and market her into the beef production chain without fear of letting that get too far and losing all the salvage value out of that cow. So really look closely at these eyes as we're getting them through the preg check, and just do all this at the same time. Look inside the eye and right at or near the cornea of the eye, on the third eyelid, the one that kind of comes over from the side, see if there's anything growing there. Look really closely for small plaques, small little specks anywhere on the eye that are the very early development of cancer eye. And again, if we need to cull a few extra cows after we've gone through these other processes, finding these tags out around on the eyelid and in the eye, in different places within the eye, and getting those gone before the next year it's something worse, or even a couple of years down the road into a situation where we can't even market that cow. So, trying to telegraph or foresee the future with whether or not these cows are going to be long-lived within the herd and still productive after we've gone through this culling process. And those eyes are extremely important to what they do, and can go quick. Even on a really good cow, can turn into a situation where we've lost some salvage value from her. So again, part of this evaluation after we've gone through these other steps in the phase culling, and we still need to relieve some pressure from the feed resources that we have, then look at those mouths. And again, this is something I'll keep repeating, that all of these procedures are something that are great to do in good years too. They just become more of a gravid situation whenever we're trying to make these decisions on which cows we're going to let leave, even though they're decent producers. So let's look at mouth. And if again, I mentioned earlier, if you don't have the actual age of a cow, then this will be a good way to get that through dentition, looking at how many of the milk teeth are gone, the baby teeth, whatever y'all would call them, white teeth, and looking at how many of the mature adult teeth are in. And then on the other side of that, on the older cows, looking for broke mouth where they're missing some teeth, or smooth mouth where it's worn all the way down to the gum. When you get into the kind of the moderate ages, maybe 6, 7, 5, 6, 7, you're starting to see some space between the lower incisors there on the bottom, or the lower incisors. So if you see that space between those teeth, that's indicating that cow's a little bit more mature, a couple of years older than this one would be, or this here. So when they get all the way out here to have what we call a smooth mouth, where the teeth are, a lot of them are missing or worn all the way down, then that should be an older cow. There's some caveats here depending on the production environment. If you have a real sandy soil where you are, then it can wear teeth down quicker. If you feed some co-products or byproducts that would be a little bit more damaging to the teeth, like example that comes up to me is sweet potatoes. If you're in a situation where you feed something like that with a different pH, it can wear the teeth down a little bit quicker. So just make those decisions based on what the mouth looks like from the standpoint of age, and a cow being able to eat effectively and maintain her body condition. Now, sometimes I've seen a cow that would have a smooth mouth like this and maintain her body condition very effectively. So you kind of have to put this all together. But again, when we're trying to make some critical decisions, when we have to liquidate some cattle because of drought, then these are going to be the things that I would get critical about, especially when I'm looking in that mouth. Feet and legs. This is an issue, another thing that's pretty important to beef cattle production from just a general genetic selection standpoint right now, but also something we can be critical about when we're culling deep into the herd. cows that persistently get foot rot, and if you keep records of that, like Dr. Loveday had mentioned, and for a lot of years there's a cow or a cow family that you deal with foot rot with before you do any others, then that's something to look at. You know, in these dry situations, you might not have to deal with that very much. But if you do know that chronically they get it, then you might want to look closely at that. Mostly what we're going to be looking for and dealing with, though, on feet and leg structure is going to be screw claw. And there will be some genetics that will give you more or less screw claw coming out in these mature cows as they get to 3, 4, and 5 years old and have a little more weight and pressure on their hooves, then it'll start coming out. So look at those, and also think about this from a genetic standpoint, back on the opportunity theme here, to look at the cows that are expressing this, and then heifers out of those cows. And if you have those kinds of records, but if you have a lot of screw claw and starting to get severe, then that cow is going to go down eventually anyway. And you want to go ahead and get the salvage value out of her, besides just clearing it out of the genetic pool as well. The way they move, some older cows getting stifled, younger cows even, but probably most of what we're going to have to focus on feet and leg structure is going to be this screw claw issue from a genetic standpoint in the cow side, but also something to look for on your sire selection as well. Checking udders, again, this is a great opportunity if you're tired of dealing with getting a cow up and milking a cow out because she's got big balloon teats that calf can't get its mouth around when it's newborn. Then this is a great opportunity to get rid of that issue and not have that problem anymore. Also, from a genetic standpoint, removing that cow from the gene pool, not being, I guess, tempted to keep a heifer out of her that's likely going to do the same thing. But also from just a production standpoint, if that cow's a good milker, if she can't deliver that cow effectively to that calf, especially when it's younger, then that's going to be an issue. You might want to even get really critical if you've got cows with good udders anyway, and looking at cows that would have subclinical mastitis. Now, we don't talk a lot about mastitis in beef cows, but it can be quite an issue from reducing overall milk production, and then from blind quarters and that kind of thing. So the way the teats are formed, looking at the end of the teat, whether it's concave or convex, and getting really critical besides just how the udder hangs, the attachment of the udder, and the teat placement and teat size. Well, you can get as critical as you want to on getting good udders in your cows, but certainly getting down to at least to this level where you've got a cow that doesn't have teeth that can't be used because it's too large to even fit in the calf's mouth when it's first born. So another opportunity, but another culling criteria if we get down in the herd this far. And some of you may want to move this part. I'm going through these as individual criteria, not necessarily in a set order now. After we get past the preg check, and if there's a certain issue that you've had in your herd that's been persistent for several years, this might be the time to start cleaning that up. And if udders have been a real issue, you might want to put this ahead of feet and legs or whatever the case may be. But kind of going down through here and being critical about all these points anyway. Now, I think the last point I have to make here on the culling criteria, it would be disposition. You know, we talk about disposition most of the time from a standpoint of safety and what they, human safety, working the cattle, but it's also a very important component of production, from cows getting bred to feeder calves doing well in a stocker environment or in the feedlot. All that can be affected greatly by temperament. And it's not just temperament of the individual animal influencing that individual animal's performance, but that individual animal influences the performance of the entire group that it's in. So it's the one bad apple spoils a barrel kind of an issue. If I put a feeder calf in a feedlot pen that's high-headed with calm calves, he's going to decrease the efficiency and weight gain of that entire pen. If it's heifers trying to breed or if it's cows trying to rebreed, then poor disposition of just one or two can affect the overall performance of that group. So being really critical about disposition on the selection side, but here as we're talking about it for getting deep in the herd on culling to relieve pressure from feed resources or to create some revenue to buy some more feed, this is a point that I want to look at as well. Be really critical about it. You'll know these. This record will probably be imprinted indelibly on your brain if you've had to deal with a kind of a high-headed cow, and you'll know that a high-headed cow begets a high-headed heifer calf, and that's just the way it works. So take this opportunity to really look at disposition and be very critical about that. Dr. Loveday, on the small ruminant side, anything you want to add there to the disposition or what I talked about earlier with udder and feet and leg structure?
Not really. The only health issue I'd add on sheep, and in particular, is prolapses after lambing. If you've kept records on those, if it's a good ewe or something like this, we get sort of happy with her, and maybe it wasn't that big of a problem. We was able to put it back in. But you're talking about situations now when you can alleviate some of those problems.
Yeah.
You've got enough problems trying to keep them fed, so why create other problems for yourself?
Yeah, that's an extremely good point, and I know we deal with that on cattle some too, and some of that can be genetic as well. So keeping replacement ewes or replacement does or replacement heifers out of these cattle that prolapse or prone to prolapse, those replacements might be prone to do that as well. So you're not only cleaning up that instance of it, but maybe some instances of it down the road. So really good point.
I guess one other thing, Justin, I'd add from a genetic standpoint, we run into the scrapiest ewe and some other birth defects or genetic defects in our sheep and goats, and again, you've kept those around because they're good producers. But again, an opportunity to clean up your flock or herd. That might be something we'd look at here in terms of some of these genetic defects that might be in our herds.
Definitely, and that kind of brings up something else that I thought about, and I'll probably we ought to ask Dr. Strickland to do one of these specifically on health and health related to drought management, but also some selection opportunities too. But things like, and Jason was just mentioning that if we're going to go ahead and start testing for BVDPI or Yonis or BLV, any of those things that we would have in cattle herds, and some of the other health issues that you'd mentioned in the flocks and goat herds, then that may be something to go ahead and take that opportunity now. The state vet lab runs those free for farm animals. They need to be issued to the lab through a veterinarian. So you'd want to get with your veterinarian to take those samples, send them into the Cord Lab or the University of Tennessee, both state labs, and they would run those for free on food animals. So yeah, I think that I don't have the health part in here specifically as a culling criteria, but probably should be something that we could get really focused on from BLV, Yonis, PIBVD, and on this movement back and forth. Dr. Strickland was mentioning to me earlier this morning about some anaplasm showing up in places that it usually doesn't. So things to certainly think about as we move cattle around or select and get really critical about the culling. Good point. So I want to wrap up my part here and leave some time for Jenny and some time for discussion as well. But just the take home overall message here: be proactive, be confident. Get all the information you can. We have a lot of information through our system, and there's a lot to be found out there. Otherwise, but be confident, but be proactive, because if we just like that, I keep using that phrase of trying to catch a falling knife, we'll get cut sometimes. Sometimes it'll make us look bad. If we'd have just waited 2 more weeks, we'd have gotten some rain, but we don't know that. So at some point, we just have to make that decision and be comfortable with it. Determine if our objectives are primarily economic or emotional. Most of us are going to be doing this from an economic standpoint, and those phases of culling and the criteria we use there for, at least in food animal production, are going to be the way to look at that economically. Just remember, all in all, from what Jason talked about and Jenny in the previous webinar about nutrition, is that it's going to be expensive to feed through a drought, whether that's bought forage hay, bought feed to stretch hay reserves. It's going to be expensive to do. So, and then the point that came out in that discussion was that culling some of these animals, marketing them, even though it's a down market as we record this, it's still going to provide some revenue to buy some resources for those other good genetics, buy some feed for those other good genetics that you do want to hang on to until we get into a better situation. And just doing all that to meet the availability of feed and based on productivity of that core herd or flock that you're trying to maintain. Okay. So Dr. Loveday, if you have anything else to mention from the small ruminant side, we can go ahead and do that now. I'm going to look at the chat box and see if there's any questions. I don't see any questions there, but if you want to add something, then I'll turn it over to Jenny.
Well, it's sort of a damper. I was watching the weather last night, and since we deal with science-based information, they were talking about the Farmer's Almanac, and it's predicting a cold, wet winter. But our weatherman here in Knoxville, using scientific models and this and that, is actually calling for a slightly milder, which is good, but drier winter. So we might have some long-lasting issues with this fall, coming out of this fall too.
That's right, coming in the winter and next spring too. So we're really thinking about the long range effects this year out coming at such an awkward time for what it's going to mean coming, for the rest of winter and coming in spring. Good points. All right, Jenny, turn it over to you to if you want to say a few things about horse ownership.
All righty, let me get my screen shared here. I'll stop yours real quick.
Okay.
All right, so I just wanted to come in and kind of address things from the equine side. And most of what Jason and Justin and Dr. Loveday have been talking about in the last few minutes really does apply to horses. But due to the demographic within the industry and some other things that we need to consider, I wanted to make sure that we mentioned it specifically for horses and other equine herds. And so, to kind of start very similarly to how Justin did, it's really important for us to remember that horse ownership is a privilege. With that privilege comes responsibility. And for that animal, we're required to provide them food, water, shelter, care, and overall interaction. And most of the time, these are met and they're met fairly well. But as we enter this, maybe drought intensive management period, that food and water can be obviously a big concern and why we're taking such time to discuss these things. But the piece that we're kind of missing is that humane end of life. And what does that really mean for that horse? And what does that mean to the owner? And so I know it's a challenge for us to talk about sometimes, and because of that emotional attachment to horses for a number of reasons. And so I think it's important for us to kind of consider, do horses fall under livestock or companion animals? And depending on what your particular view is on your horses and what you utilize them for, may classify them into different sections. But either way, whether we're viewing them as a companion or view them as your livestock, we still have feed requirements and water requirements that these horses need. And unfortunately, they're both going to have that end point where we may need to consider, is there another option, whether it's culling or whether it's, moving on to a different home that's more humane for that animal. And so kind of to echo some of the points that were made earlier, the two big pieces that, you need to look at here if we're not utilizing horses for a production standpoint, and they're really just more of a recreational purpose, are those horses earning their keep? And are we able to be, to find a food source for them that is valuable enough to justify the cost of ownership? Especially as we move into winter and, maybe we've got some horses that are harder keepers or ones that are a little bit more challenging, that may wind up impacting the actual ability for us to provide adequate care. And so I would encourage, the horse owners that are listening or maybe considering what their options might be if the financial cost is too great, are those horses really providing any sort of return for you? Whether that be, enough of a return if we're using them for a business model, are they bred, are they open, are we producing a good foal crop, or are they really just out more as, like I said, a companion situation? And is that enough to justify the amount that we're going to need to spend to winter them and possibly have some issues feeding throughout the spring. The next piece, and we'll talk, really briefly about the unwanted horse issue, but what are the most marketable horses that you have? And, are they marketable from the standpoint that we could maybe utilize some sales or some other change of ownership versus actual culling to be able to get those horses what they need and alleviate the financial and responsibility of ownership on that particular owner. And some of that may mean adding some additional skills and some additional things to that horse within their tool set to be able to make them a more marketable outcome overall. And so really briefly, I think it's important for us to think about the amount of horses that actually go unwanted within the United States every year, and then how the drought can actually impact the ability for horse owners to find alternate homes or alternate places to send those animals if they're unable to care for them. And so unwanted is kind of a loose term and can encompass numerous different things. But in about 2007, there was a study done that estimated that within the United States, over 170,000 horses went unwanted annually. And that number has grown substantially since 2007. And you can see that, there's a variety of reasons why these horses may wind up being unwanted by their current owner. So are they sick or injured? Are they older and they no longer serve the particular purpose that they did when they were younger? More often we see the unmanageable, unrideable, or dangerous as being a fairly high reason. And do they fail to meet the owner's expectations? So all of these are reasons, if you're looking at maybe your herd and the ones that we should or should not keep or are able to keep throughout this particular drought situation, if your horses fall into any of these and you've got that consideration of this may not work for my particular management system or my particular skill set, that's very important to keep in mind and be able to try and make an objective decision off of that. That last bullet point and what I think we're looking at right now is, do we have that financial constraint and are we unable to feed horses to the level that we should? And if we are, trying to avoid that really low body condition score and the welfare that would go along with that for that animal. So being able to really think about, why is this horse having an issue and what are my options from there? Kind of where we can go from here, and I apologize that the image is blurry on this, but what are the options for you as the owner? And so sale may be the first thought, but I would really encourage you to kind of remember that unwanted horse number, because what we're seeing is that there's a huge supply of horses that are entering into the sale ring and there's not a very large demand. So being able to actually make any sort of a profit or even sometimes being able to find a sale, a successful sale for that horse can be challenging. Throughout the state of Tennessee, there are a couple auction sites that you might be able to utilize if that is something that you're looking for. The benefit of that auction, it might be a faster sale. That horse may wind up bringing a lower price, but usually there's a little bit more of a chance that you'll be able to go and get that horse sold if it fits the market within that sale specifically. They also, run the risk of saying this particular sale, we may take the horse here and have to come home with it. It's not a guarantee. And we'll talk about that a little bit more here in the next couple of slides. Private treaty is also an option, but this usually has a greater time commitment. So if we're looking at making management decisions to help reduce herd numbers as we thin out that forage source, private treaty may take a little bit too long. Also here, it's important to mention price. So usually private treaty will see a higher sale price overall. But again, we've got a little bit more of a time commitment in there. So weighing that as your particular management option and what you're doing for your herd or your horses may alter that a little bit. Leasing is also a great option, but here, again, we need to make sure that that horse has a marketable skill. So if we're dealing with something that's maybe retired or old or sick or injured, getting someone else to lease and take the financial responsibility of that animal off of you may not be a viable option. The other is that due to that unwanted horse number and the amount that we see within the country and throughout Tennessee, most of the rescue and retirement facilities that we were able to utilize previously are either full at capacity or just not accepting any other horses at this time due to restricted feed sources. And so I would really encourage horse owners to think about the fact that if you do get to a point where forage resources are limited, or you get to the end point where a decision has to be made, do not rely on just rescue or retirement facilities to accept your horses, because right now many of them are not. Donation sometimes is an option depending on the breed, if we can find a research program or something like that. But again, do not rely on that as the only option overall. We see a couple second careers be successful for these horses, but without those marketable skills to be able to make them a viable option, that may not work. So if we're thinking about, again, having the financial resources to be able to feed these horses throughout that training period, getting a second career and making them a marketable animal for that may not work, which kind of leaves us with our overall topic of today, the euthanasia and culling section, and choosing that option as an end for your horse. And so although this comes with a great emotional attachment to it, sometimes this really is the best option for our horses to prevent a situation where we may see excessive weight loss or neglect or things like that. So I would really encourage horse owners to look at that option if needed. And so we do have a few options that are available to horse owners, and I wanted to make sure that we kind of talked about this issue a little bit before we finished. But our three options, barbiturate overdose, captive bolt, and gunshot, are the ones that are certified by the American Veterinary Association as being humane end-of-life options for horses and other livestock. Barbiturate overdose needs to be done and completed by a licensed veterinarian, but may cause some challenges with regard to burial sites and leaching of that fluid from the carcass into the ground, and groundwater. So if it's something that we're able to utilize this option, just being sure that we're considerate of that particular environmental impact. Captive bolt's not usually seen too much within the horse industry just because not many have access to it, but still a completely humane method and is widely accepted. And then gunshot. So again, just, if there's someone that is trained in these, or if you need or have any other questions, contact your county extension agent about being able to consider those culling and euthanasia selections. But I do want to talk about equine processing. And so this is received a lot of social media attention and attention from a lot of humane activist groups throughout the last few years. But in 2007, the government suspended funds to support USDA inspectors working at plants where equine meat was processed for human consumption. And so it's not that equine slaughter is illegal in the United States, but it is that the USDA inspectors are not able to inspect those plants. And therefore, we don't see as much equine slaughter within the United States. With that being said, horses are legally still shipped to Canada and Mexico. So there are some sales that if this is an option and should be an option for horse owners to prevent that situation where the only choice is maybe neglect or lack of feeding, there is an ability, to be able to have those horses legally sent and humanely cared for during the processing period. And so just again, something to consider if we're getting to the point that culling options and culling is really what we wind up needing to do for the best interest of that humane end of life option for that horse owner. There is a few ways that we can make sure that that gets done. But overall, we're looking at a lot of the same concepts between, making good management decisions, being able to find good quality food sources, being able to say, what is this horse really working for? And is the cost of ownership outweighing the cost of feed? And what are your options from there? So with that, I will turn it back over to Justin and see if we've got any questions.
Jenny, I don't see any questions in the chat box at the moment. Give a second here for maybe anybody that wants to type one in, give them an opportunity to do that. Dr. Loveday, do you think of any other closing thoughts as we wrap up here and give people an opportunity to type a question if they have one?
Hey, Justin, this is Peter. I'm here if you need me to weigh in on anything.
Oh, great. Hey,
Sorry for being late. I got hung up in a committee meeting that went longer than expected.
That's quite all right. We talked a lot about the selection criteria for culling, and as you get deeper into needing to cull to meet limited feed resources, pregnancy checking primarily, and then a lot of structural and production type things. If there's anything you can think that stands out for unique for dairy production as a culling criteria, then maybe that, but otherwise we're good.
That would have been what I had on my list. The only thing I'd say, I think maybe the best analogy that I've heard a dairy farmer use was he thinks of his freestall barn as a hotel, and every cow that isn't paying a sufficient amount for that space maybe needs to have a different career choice than being a dairy cow.
Yeah.
So I think that is certainly even more pressing in this kind of time when time is limited. And the other, I'd say, consider your long-term goals about herd size and growth, and then take a really hard look at your young stock and think about, do you really need to raise every one of those calves into a dairy animal? Because again, even though they're eating a lot less than a lactating cow, that's still taking down your overall feed inventory. So that might be a time to raise what you need and be selective of those animals that you're going to raise up into the lactating herd and get rid of some earlier on.
Yeah. Okay. Good points. The one thing that I just remembered I'd mentioned I was going to talk a little bit more about too from the beef cattle production side of things, and this may actually work with small ruminants as well, but just reevaluating overall stocking rate of cows on your given land area that you're trying to produce on. And so if you're stocking to the max and say you're running 50 cows and you're that's runs you right to the limit of feed resources every year, and then you come to a drought situation like this and you have to start selling cows and substantially get into the mature cow herd, and maybe, and as we continue, Jason had mentioned this in the last webinar too, as we continue to encounter more frequent issues with drought, then it may be that you want to step back and look and not totally maximize the stocking rate from a mature cow herd standpoint, but then in years when you do have more forage available than what the cow herd is consuming, then maintaining the calf crop longer and stockering those and selling yearlings instead of selling weaned calves. And then in years when we are in a pinch, especially when it gets into the late summer and fall like we are now on forage availability, then we can go ahead and sell those calves at a kind of what would be a standard time for spring-born calves at weaning. And then, even if we have to back up further than that, then early weaning. So if we don't have the maximum stocking pressure with the cow herd, then I think of it as kind of a flex type situation. I can flex with the calves and how much weight I put on the calves rather than selling and having to restock cows later. So,
and Justin, just to add a little bit to that, I think you used a word that's pretty impactful, and that's maximize. And I think that's something that, even though maybe some of the official numbers from a beef cattle or beef cow herd retention standpoint, we really haven't seen reported, but over the past few years with record high feeder cattle prices, I think a lot of producers really stretched their resources to the max so that they could maximize essentially the amount of calf that they were selling. And I think we need to really think about optimizing rather than maximizing. And so if we've been, if we've kind of pushed things to the limit to react to some of those record high and fairly unrealistically high feeder cattle prices, and have not yet reacted to that change in the market, it's something we definitely need to think about, especially considering limited feed resources and drought conditions.
all right. I think those are all good comments. I don't see any questions in the chat box, so we'll go ahead and wind this down. And if you're watching this recording or if you're on here live, just always want to remind you that you have a contact for production type questions and information right there in every county in the state of Tennessee and in your local UT Extension agent. And if again, if they don't have the answers that you need at that time, then they can find somebody that does. So contact them or us if you have questions about this as it relates to drought or any other production type questions as we go forward. So appreciate you hooking on, those that are watching live, and best of luck to us. And I'm doing everything I can to make it rain. I left my boots in the back of the truck, and I left the windows down overnight and that kind of stuff. So we'll see if we can keep try and make it rain.
Yeah, hopefully if we talk about it enough, it'll happen. That seems to be how it goes. So
definitely. All right, everybody take care and have a good rest of the week.
Yeah, thanks, Justin. You too.